Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.
Sense makers.
Hey guys, nice to see you again. I'm excited to talk about practicing in database today.
Okay.
Let's get into it.
All right. So in part one, I had talked about kind of Alteryx and being able to set up my own MySQL database. What that allowed me to do was to be able to practice the problem in Alteryx. However, something I noticed in there is it took me about 30 minutes to set up my own database. That might not be realistic for everybody to do, but you can still practice these problems, and you can practice this problem by just following Alteryx's recommendation on how to study. And that's going to start with the syntax. So what we're going to cover today is how to write select statements, where clause, case statements, and wildcards. So these are going to be universal across SQL, but they're going to be different in different databases. And so within an individual database, there's actually going to be particular terms that I'm going to mention that they're going to want you to cover as well.
Okay.
And so those terms are going to include cast statements, convert statements, if null, date diff, and convert. So this is what Alteryx is saying to focus on, these types of statements. Now, these types of statements can sit in one database, but I would just make sure that whatever database you practice in, whether it's MySQL or SQL Server or Oracle, what have you, whatever you're comfortable with, just understand what database are you being asked to do this problem in, and then just knowing how to translate that to that database. But it's not necessarily about knowing which tool to use, it's knowing the syntax and how to write it in a way that is correct. So what I'm taking you to is a website called LeetCode. And what this website is it's a landing spot to practice programming languages. So it has SQL, it has Python, it has R, it has JavaScript, and all it requires is just a simple login.
Okay. So if I wanted to just polish my Python, I could come here and just kind of bang away at it.
Correct. And so once you get a login, you can come in and you can search by topic and then be able to figure out how to solve practice problems. And what they'll actually do is they'll give you a scenario, they'll give you data, they'll give you a problem statement, and then they'll ask you to solve it.
Okay.
But that's not the scope of what we're trying to focus on today. Focusing on today is just being introduced to this website. It exists, and this is just a vehicle you can use to practice if working with a database in Alteryx Designer is a prohibitive feature for you. This is a problem I want you to be able to solve, to have some confidence in being able to do, and you can do it by just following a handful of lines of code that I've written here, taking a look at them. You can recreate this in your own environment and just break it, type stuff in, see what happens when you have wrong syntax, what kind of error message does it give you, but then also you can execute a statement and see the results. So before getting too far ahead of myself, I want to note here, this practice problem here on the left is just one I picked because it has data types that you're going to need to work with. It's going to have integers or numbers, it's got dates, it's also got enum, which in this case is a category, so categorical data. Despite having 4 columns in this table activity, I have enough to work with and enough to practice on that I can spend 30 minutes, an hour and a half getting comfortable writing some of these statements, because you want this to be muscle memory as much as you can by the time you get to the exam. So what I have here is once I get into the code, you'll notice a little drop down. And so I can pick MySQL,
Ooh, very slick.
Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, Pandas, Postgres. So this is kind of what I was talking about in part one. They might change. You don't necessarily know what database you're going to be in. So just being able to kind of practice, get comfortable in one, and then maybe just port over to another. Now, I wouldn't say practice everything. You want to be efficient with your time, but at least just have a little bit of context, a little bit flag in your head of like, oh, this was different in this one or that one. Like, I just want to get a good baseline and know when you need to pivot, which is a big theme of this exam. So in this particular instance, I'm choosing to write it in Microsoft SQL Server.
Okay.
These terms match the terms on the documentation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's just going to be in this database. It could be in another. I built Alteryx in MySQL. I'm going to show you this version, and then I'll also show you how I did it in MySQL, writing the exact same type of query, and you'll notice the differences.
Okay.
So without getting too far ahead of myself, so first off, one of the key terms that they're going to want you to know is a cast. A cast statement is just a way to convert a number to a string, vice versa. In this instance, I'm taking my session ID, which is an integer, and I'm making it a varchar. And then I'm casting it. This as statement here is basically saying that I'm naming this column. I'm giving it an alias as PID cast.
Okay.
And I want to jump in here on one thing with this, because this is one of the places where I see Alteryx as more a tool for humans and help people to not have to write SQL versus having to write SQL. There's no spaces in the field names here. Alteryx totally lets us put spaces in field names. And this is one of those places where that SQL syntax can start getting way more complicated really quickly. And just sticking with what you wrote here and keep it simple with just using field names that have no spaces really helps.
Yeah, exactly. So the next one down is a format. So you notice the format, and what I tried to do in this instance was that I'm taking my session ID, which is really just a number, 4. I've made it a cast statement. I've made it a string. But what you'll notice is in this format, what I did is just the way I've got the zeros aligned, the period, and then stuff to the right. You'll notice at the bottom here, my results. My 4 shows up because I'm choosing to have 2 leading columns. And if it's not there, then force a 0. And then adding 4 columns to the end. A format can come up if maybe you have to work with currency as an output, or you have to truncate your data in a certain way that they want it in a particular output format. Just being comfortable that this syntax exists, how to write it, and then you can see kind of how this number changes by just referencing the same base column by just these 3 formulas.
Got it. Okay, so I'm working on the in-database tools, and in other tools in Alteryx in memory, I might be able to do this type of formatting thing in the tool itself, but here we're in database, and if the instructions for the exam say, output this for me in a specific currency format or something, I'm going to need to be able to use SQL to do that.
Correct.
And one other thing is the formula tool in the in-database tool in Alteryx is the SQL command.
Correct.
Yep. Yeah. So this practice you're showing us here, Matthew, is great.
And something to note, the basic part of the filter in the in-database tool is very limiting to like very specific examples. But if you need to write something and need to use that custom advanced expression editor, these syntax that you see here, these statements are going to be what you need to use. Stuff just like this. Okay. And you can't just get away with, leveraging the basic and doing a drop down. It might not be that simple to get the answer.
So that generic formula tool that's in database is only going to get me so far, and I'm going to need to fall back on some of this stuff here in the formula editor.
Yep, formula or even a filter, and the filter as an expression editor too. If you have to filter data out in a way that leverages SQL, that isn't a basic equals, greater than, not equals to, kind of your standard commands. If you need something a little more, you'll need something like this. Okay. So just working our way down, date diff. In the example I had shown before in MySQL, it was two columns. And it just did a date time calculation. You'll notice here, if I'm doing this in MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server, it has 3 components. I have to pick the type, so day, week, month, year, and then I have to pick the columns. So activity date is the column I'm referencing, but if I want to reference today, in Microsoft SQL Server, I'm going to reference get date. So that's going to be a database specific value that, depending on what you're in, if you have to reference today, something that you might need to Google, or just know that you have to Google, and you don't necessarily have to memorize, what is what in what system.
Yep. Yeah, one of my web searches for things like that is I might use the name of the database, like SQL Server get current date, or even SQL Server and then whatever the Postgres or the MySQL function is. And then somebody's post somewhere will say, here's how this converts over in this other platform. So yeah, and dates are definitely one of those that are different. Yep.
Yeah, totally. And so you've said, Matthew, that the exam authors might someday have you working in Postgres and a different day have you working in MySQL. A lot of times I'll use like a GPT to get my syntax right, because it's basically the modern aggregator for Stack Overflow, right? So instead of trying to get to the Stack Overflow thread, I'll ask GPT to help me get the syntax right. Is that a thing that I could do here in the Alteryx Expert Exam?
It is something that I would not recommend doing. Currently, it is not explicitly stated one way or another, but that is subject to change. And because of the intent of ChatGPT, which is generally to just have it give you an answer versus you finding an answer, I think you can make a pretty good case that it would violate terms of service of the exam, of possibly going into areas of using AI, LLM to give you an answer that they really want you to find for yourself. So I would not use ChatGPT at all. I would stick with what they recommend and stick with the process of using Google, not logging in the websites, leaning on documentation from Alteryx, and just stay into those three areas, and you'll be fine.
So then, Jonathan, your tip about knowing how to Google for this, because I'm not going to memorize the difference between a date diff in MySQL versus SQL Server. So having the Google hack available so that you know how to get Google to give you those syntax back on the first query is going to be a real time saver.
Absolutely. And sometimes, Google, I would say, is your backup. Do the most that you can that your primary this is muscle memory. You've hammered in at least one system, at one database. Just be comfortable in one database of just how to do all of it, and just see how far you can get. And then that way, it's just one less thing you have to Google. That's 30 seconds. That's a minute.
Yeah, and so I'm picking up what you're putting down. You're saying, look, Alteryx is saying these are the commands we're going to ask you about. We're going to want you to cast. We're going to want you to convert. We're going to want you to check this stuff null, right? Like we're going to want you to format numbers, use a case statement. There's only a half a dozen of those. You might as well just come to this LeetCode website, familiarize yourself with how they work, be intimate with the fact that they're a little bit different from database to database, and just have that under your belt before you go into this thing so that you can win yourself time on the clock. Okay.
Correct. Yep. Because, if you're studying for the exam and you want to budget time for each question on how to study, this is where I would study. I would study in the first series I talked about. If I'm in Alteryx and I have the ability to do it, I would study the managed connections. I would study data stream in. I would study writing. And then for the filters, formulas, etc. of the world, I would live in here. This is going to be the bread and butter, your transformations. Practice, practice, practice. You don't even try, even if you don't get it perfect, that's okay. It'll give you an error message. And that error message could save you on the exam if you know that it's a cast error or it's a date diff error on the error code. And then that way, when Alteryx tells you the code, which is coming from the database, you know what kind of debug you need to do. Yeah. And with these exams, simple steps, very procedural, break it down. It's very unlikely that you're not going to make a mistake on this exam. You're going to make mistakes. It's about finding your mistake, troubleshooting it, and moving on versus spending 20 minutes, 30 minutes debugging. If you set yourself up correctly, it should not take you very long to diagnose where the problem is happening. And if you make small transformations and small steps and space it out, it'll be easier to debug versus if you try and consolidate too many things at once. writing too many, stacking formulas or writing multiple conditional logic. That can get you into some trouble. But in terms of the terms, as you mentioned, ISNULL. So ISNULL, if you're not familiar, is basically saying that if a column has a null value, impute a value or put a placeholder there. So if session ID has a null value, put in 6,000. That's how I wrote it here. And you can do this as practice too, and then that way it'll stand out to you and be obvious, just in case, you get null data. For the Tableau, Alteryx hybrid folks of the world, this case when statement is going to be very friendly, very familiar to you. If you've had to write a calculated field in Tableau, it's going to work similar here. The only difference is you don't have to declare a field up front. You just start with your case, and then I'm using my session ID to just determine like kind of an if-else-if logic in Alteryx. And I'm just saying, if it's greater than 5, then, SID greater than 5. If it's less than or equal to 5, then it's less than 5. And then I have my else statement. I end it, and then I just call it my S test. So at the end of each of these, I'm just declaring a specific column to just make it easier for me down the road to know what I did. And I can just check my results down here. I see in my results, this is how my data is coming back. So this is all part of my select statement. This is just querying the columns, doing manipulations, transformations to my base columns to get me a result that I want. So that takes my select statement from, that's just going to be your tables. So the table in this instance is activity.
Okay.
Right now, I'm just calling one table. If you have multiple tables, you can certainly write a join statement, an inner join or an outer join. If you're comfortable with doing that and you're comfortable with the syntax, I would say go ahead with caution, with the caution being that it's easy to make a mistake once you start compounding logic in one step. Because if you do have an error, it could take you a little longer to debug. If you're very comfortable, if SQL is second nature to you, by all means. But if it's not second nature to you and you don't do this several hours a day every day, try and keep it simple. Keep each tool to be maybe one table at a time. Let the Alteryx tools do the joining. Leverage simple. Try to keep it one step at a time.
And will the exam require joins? Writing joins within SQL, or is in database an option in that case?
Yeah, so the exam's going to require you to use joins. How you use them is up to you. They're going to give you a problem statement. They'll give you data that is in a database. Some of it might not be in a database. Some of it might be, in other tables in a database. They're going to say you can do it how you want. So you can write it as part of a statement, like here. You could use the join in database tool if you wish. My personal recommendation is to try and use the Alteryx tools to do some of the heavier lifting for that and have smaller discrete steps. But if you're comfortable with writing it, you're allowed to write a join statement in a query if you so desire, but it is not going to be required. And then the final part of the query to know is just going to be your where clause. Your where clause is going to be, the way I like to think of it is it's your filter. So where session ID is greater than 1, this has a filter component, and activity type is like session. So one of the elements that they had mentioned on the exam is wildcards. So right here, this percent is just a wildcard up front to say anything before session, grab it. And that's what like is saying. So just anything that has a like, anything before session, and you can see the results down here. So it'll grab open session or end session.
Right, but nothing that doesn't end with that. And so that's that wildcard. And so the Alteryx exam designers are telegraphing in advance that they're going to want you to know how to use a wildcard. So you might as well come here and practice and get good at that because you know it's coming, right?
Yes, and the thing is, once again, you can't necessarily just solve this with Alteryx in-database filter tools. The filter tool can do some very basic operations, like say maybe a field is not null, but if you have to do wildcards or more advanced expression editing, you have to write an expression like this to get your result. There's just no way around it.
Mm-hmm. And I'm getting the sense that that's really what this set of questions on the exam is about, is to make sure that you have the ability to use these tools and to do these things. Because the basics of the filter tool and a drop-down menu are going to be fairly limited, you're going to have to fall over to an expression editor and write some SQL, and they're examining to confirm that you're proficient with being able to do that.
Indeed.
Okay.
So this is how you would do it in Microsoft SQL Server or T-SQL.
Okay.
But what I do want to show you is this tab here, which has the same query, the same objective, but very different syntax. So this is MySQL. So if I go to MySQL, you'll notice that how I write my cast statement as a character 50,
Mm-hmm.
my convert is functionally a cast.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
My format is going to be a left pad function because it doesn't have format for numeric. I'm going to use left pad for zero padding, or R pad if I need to do right padding. My date diff is called date diff, but you'll notice that there's only 2 elements, not 3. My if null is the same. My case when statement is the same, but I wouldn't focus on what's the same or what's different. I would just understand that different databases are going to do syntax differently, and it just helps to practice in a couple. So in the event you get a question in a certain system, you can migrate over. And you know, format conceptually in SQL means I'm just changing the value of how it looks, adding leading zeros, or adding 2 values after a decimal place or 3 decimal places. That's the concept they want you to know, and that's how they want you to be familiar. So don't focus on memorizing it in the system. Focus on the terms. Focus on these concepts. And so if you can do it in a couple different systems, get those reps in, it'll be easier to pivot and maybe one less Google search in case they give you a database that, you know, is not expected.
Yep. It's really about understanding how these things function, having them under your belt in one database technology, and then being able to, like you say, pivot or adjust, or figure out the nuances around the edges if you get something you didn't expect.
Correct.
Okay.
So that'll bring us home for part 2. Once again, LeetCode is just a vehicle. The reason I like it is because it's free. You can just log in and you can pick different database formats and use that environment to practice in. And you can also use practice problems on there if you do actually want to solve their problems. So by the time you get around to Alteryx, you're more comfortable and confident. In the next video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on approach that aren't in the first 2 that are more technical. And I look forward to seeing both of you there.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks, Matthew.
All right.
Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.